Updated one cells in Greek life. L13R, there you are. Welcome, welcome. Let me know if you'd like to dim those lights a little lower, maybe pull up a cushion or two, and let's settle into that quiet, late-night corner where history doesn't rush, it lingers. You're in for a tale that's part social experiment, part drunken bet, all ancient Athens, where the price of freedom could hinge on whether you could outdrink your way to victory or vomit your way to defeat. And before we begin, if you'd like to share where in the world this journey finds you, I'd love to know. Perhaps a comment with your location, or maybe just a quiet nod toward liking and subscribing, so the next tale feels even more like it was meant for you. No pressure, of course, just history as it should be. Slow, curious, and occasionally a bit tipsy. Now, let's talk about slaves in ancient Athens, specifically Greek slaves, and whether one could, by some stroke of luck or sheer willpower, drink his way to freedom. I say his, because, while slavery was no stranger to women, the records we have, fragments, inscriptions, a few too vivid vignettes from plays, tend to focus on male slaves, particularly those in households or workshops where their labor had value beyond mere subsistence. And if there's one thing ancient Greeks loved more than debating philosophy or trading olive oil, it was getting drunk and making rules about who could drink the most without collapsing into a heap of dignity, or at least self-respect. So, could a slave win his freedom by outlasting his owner in a drinking contest? Well, that depends on whether you believe in the mythos of Greek democracy, or its more messy realities. First, let's clarify what we mean by drinking contest. In modern terms, it might evoke images of shot glasses clinking, friends cheering, perhaps a dare or two, but in Athens, the Synapian, Sigma Upsilon Nu Alpha Pi Iota Omicron Nu, as it was sometimes called, was less about camaraderie and more about ritualized competition. The rules varied. Sometimes it was about downing cups without pause, other times about drinking from a vessel of unmeasured size until you fell over or puked, or perhaps, if the contest was more refined, which is debatable, sipping while maintaining some semblance of composure. The goal: to outdo your opponent in volume or endurance, but also to do so without losing your temper, which, for a slave, might mean not throwing a wine jug at your master's head. That last part was crucial. A drunk Greek could be volatile, and a slave's volatility had consequences beyond just a sore head the next morning. Now, could a slave even participate in such contests? The short answer is, it depended on who you were talking to. Legally, slaves had no rights, so technically, no. But in practice, life in Athens was far more complicated than legal codes suggested. Slave owners often treated their slaves with varying degrees of severity, some as property, others as extended family, particularly if they were skilled. Think scribes, metalworkers, or household managers. And if a slave was already trusted to handle wine, say, as a server in a symposium, or perhaps even as the one who mixed the wine's dilution for guests, a drinking contest wasn't entirely out of the question. After all, if you're already mixing the stuff, knowing how much someone can take becomes part of your job description. But let's pause here for a moment, because we're drifting into territory where history starts to feel like folklore. The idea of a slave winning freedom through skill is romantic, isn't it? It suggests that in the belly of a system built on exploitation, there was room for cleverness, for defiance disguised as play. And while there are asterisk stories that fit this narrative, like the one where the comic playwright Pherecrates supposedly freed his slave by composing a play that made the audience laugh so hard they awarded him a prize, such tales often read more like moralizing fables than historical fact. They're the ancient world's equivalent of a poor boy makes good myths, but with wine instead of rags. The problem is, the records we have are thin, and what little evidence we do have is usually from elite sources, men writing about other men, often for the edification or entertainment of their peers. Take the Asterisk Symposium by Plato, for example. It's a text that's equal parts philosophical manual and drinking party brag sheet. where Socrates, who probably never drank that much, holds court while his guests debate virtue, love, and whether it's better to be drunk or sober. Nowhere in this dialogue does a slave pop up as the winner of a contest, but that doesn't mean slaves weren't there, just that their presence wasn't deemed worthy of note unless they served to illustrate some moral point. Which is to say, if a slave asterisk did win his freedom by drinking, Plato probably wouldn't have mentioned it because the lesson would have been about humility or hubris, not about systemic change. But let's consider the mechanics. For a slave to even asterisk attempt such a contest, he'd need two things: permission from his owner, which implies a certain level of trust or perhaps just boredom on the owner's part, and a way to bet something tangible on the outcome. Freedom was the obvious prize, but how would that work? Would the slave wager his own freedom against his owner's promise to grant it if he won? That seems unlikely. Slaves weren't property in the same way livestock or tools were. They had value as laborers, and losing one through a drinking contest would be an expensive proposition for the owner. More plausible is that the prize was something else: a sum of money, perhaps, or a tool, or even just the right to earn wages without supervision. But if freedom was the bet, it would have required the owner to publicly acknowledge that the slave's victory had monetary value, which complicates things legally and socially. Then there's the question of whether slaves could asterisk afford asterisk to lose such a contest. If a slave bet his freedom and lost, what happened? Would he be punished more severely than usual, sold on? Or would the owner simply laugh it off and keep him around, now with the added humiliation of having been bested by someone beneath him in status? The records don't say, but we can imagine. Humiliation was a key part of Greek social control, particularly for slaves. A slave who lost a contest might have faced not just physical consequences, but ritual ones, perhaps being made to drink from a specific cup, or wearing a humiliating garment, or even being forced to serve others in a way that reminded everyone of his defeat. But let's talk about the contests themselves. What did they look like? The most famous account comes from Athenaeus, a 2nd century AD scholar who loved nothing more than compiling lists of drunks and their antics. He describes a contest where participants would drink from a asterisk kylix asterisk, a shallow, two-handled cup, until they fell over or vomited. The winner was the one who could endure the longest without losing his wits or his lunch. Now, if a slave were to enter this, he'd need to know when to stop, because going too far could mean not just losing the bet, but also endangering himself physically. Wine in Athens wasn't the smooth, watered-down stuff you might imagine. It was often mixed with water, though how much varied by class and occasion. And undiluted, it was more like liquid fire. A slave who didn't know his limits risked becoming a liability, stumbling, vomiting, or worse, passing out in a way that made him unable to work the next day. There's also the matter of who judged asterisk these contests. In a household, the master would have been the arbiter, but if it was among peers, say, at a symposium where slaves served, then perhaps a guest or another slave might take on the role. But judgment in such matters wasn't just about timing, it was also about decorum. A true asterisk Carlos Kagathos, good and beautiful man, didn't lose control. He controlled his drinking, even as he indulged. For a slave to win by embodying that ideal would have been particularly galling for the owner, because it would have meant the slave was performing a version of masculinity denied to him in other ways. That's probably why we don't hear much about slaves winning. It wasn't just the rules they were breaking. It was the very idea of their worthiness. And yet, there asterisk are hints that such contests happened. In Aristophanes, Cloud's asterisk, a character named Strepsiades tries to get his son to teach him rhetoric so he can avoid paying debts, and in one scene, they both drink heavily while arguing. While neither is a slave, the dynamic of a father trying and failing to outdrink his son plays with the same themes of control and submission. It's not a slave narrative, but it is asterisk about power dynamics in drinking culture, which suggests that if slaves were involved, they'd have done so in similar ways, perhaps as participants, perhaps as observers, their laughter or silence adding another layer to the contest. But let's not forget the economic side of this. For a slave to buy his freedom, he needed money, and drinking contests weren't exactly a reliable way to earn it unless you were very good at them. Slaves who worked in taverns or wine shops might have had more opportunities, but even then, their earnings usually went to their owners. So if a slave asterisk did win enough cash through contests to purchase his freedom, he'd need to negotiate with his owner, a negotiation that would have been fraught with tension. Would the owner sell him out of generosity, out of spite, or because the slave had proven himself in some way beyond just drinking? Here's where we hit a snag. The records are silent on most of this. We have laws about manumission, how slaves could be freed, what paperwork was required, but they're usually framed in terms of legal transactions between free men. A slave buying his freedom through labor or savings is one thing and far more common, but doing so through a drinking contest, that's the stuff of gossip, not law codes. Which means if it did asterisk happen, it wasn't systematic. It was an exception, a rare moment where the rules bent enough to let someone slip through. But let's think about the psychology for a second. If you're a slave in Athens, your life is one of enforced moderation in nearly every aspect. Your speech, your movements, even your expressions are regulated by the eyes and whips, metaphorical or otherwise, of those around you. Drinking, though, was one area where slaves had some agency. They were the ones pouring the wine, after all. They knew who could take it and who couldn't. So if a slave asterisk did enter a contest, he'd be playing with fire in more ways than one, literally, given how often symposia involved fire for warmth or light. And if he won, well, that moment of victory would have been fleeting. Freedom wasn't just handed over. It was earned through years of labor, or saved for, or sometimes even stolen, metaphorically or literally. A drinking contest could buy a night's worth of pride, maybe a tool, perhaps a few drachmae, but it couldn't buy the papers that made you legally free. There's also the matter of whether slaves asterisk wanted asterisk to drink in such contests. Wine was a symbol of freedom itself, at least for men. A free man drank, a slave served. To drink like a free man, even if only for an hour, must have been intoxicating in more ways than one. But it also risked drawing attention, which could be dangerous. If your owner found out you were challenging him, he might have seen it as insubordination, not skill. So the slave's bet wasn't just about winning. It was about doing so without being noticed until it was too late to take back. And let's not overlook the role of women here, though they're often absent from these discussions. Slave women worked in households, served wine, or perhaps even mixed it, and their labor was essential. Could they have won such contests? The evidence is thinner, but if a mistress allowed her slave woman to compete, perhaps as part of a household celebration, it would have been a different kind of power play entirely. A female slave drinking to excess in front of male guests would have disrupted the norms of gender and status in ways that male slaves couldn't. But again, we're in the realm of speculation here. The records don't preserve her voice. Now, let's talk about the aftereffects. If a slave asterisk did win his freedom through a drinking contest, what then? Would he have been celebrated? Or would he have been seen as having cheated the system, as having used a trick instead of hard work to earn his liberty? The Greeks loved winners, but they also distrusted those who relied on luck or cunning over effort. A slave who drank his way free might have been admired for his nerve, but he'd also likely faced skepticism about how asterisk truly earned his freedom was. And here's the irony. In a culture that prized moderation, at least in theory, drinking contests were a way to prove you could handle excess without losing yourself. A slave who did so would have been embodying an ideal of control, even as he transgressed the rules. It's not unlike modern underdog stories where the poor guy wins through sheer will. Except here, The sheer will is measured in cups of wine and the risk of vomiting on your owner's sandals. But let's ground this a bit more. What do we know for certain? Well, we know that slaves could earn money outside their master's household, through renting themselves out, working as artisans, or even running small businesses with permission. We also know that drinking contests were common in symposia, often with stakes beyond just bragging rights, though those were important too. And we know that manumission was a real possibility, though it required either the slave's savings or his master's generosity, or sometimes both. So could a poor Greek slave buy freedom by winning a drinking contest. The evidence suggests it might have happened, but it would have been rare, chaotic, and probably not as straightforward as the mythos would lead us to believe. It wouldn't have been a path to freedom for most slaves. It would have been a gamble, a moment of rebellion disguised as sport. And if it did work, it would have been because the owner was in a good mood that day, or drunk himself, or perhaps just tired of looking at his slave's face. There's also the question of whether such contests were even fair. A free man betting against a slave wasn't just a mismatch of status, it was a mismatch of power. The slave had more to lose if he failed: his life, his labor, his body. So when we imagine him standing there, cup in hand, we're not just seeing a competition. We're seeing a negotiation of power, where the rules are flexible and the stakes are real. But let's not forget the humor in all this. The Greeks loved their drinking contests, especially when they involved absurdity or humiliation. Imagine a slave mid-contest suddenly realizing he's about to lose, but instead of quitting, which would have been smart, he doubles down, laughing, challenging his owner to drink faster, knowing full well that speed isn't the same as endurance. Or perhaps he starts reciting poetry while drinking, trying to impress the guests with his education, only to slur the last line and get laughed at for it. These moments would have been the stuff of tavern tales, passed down through generations of slaves and freedmen alike. And yet, for all the humor, there's a stark reality beneath it. Slavery in Athens wasn't just about labor, it was about dehumanization. A slave who won his freedom through such means wouldn't have been celebrated as a hero. He'd likely be seen as having tricked the system, or perhaps even as having cheated. After all, if you can drink your way to freedom, what's stopping others from doing the same? The very idea that someone beneath you in status could outmaneuver you was probably more disturbing than any vomit on a rug. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a question. Is the tale of the slave who drank his way to freedom just a myth, or is there a grain of truth in it? I think it's both. Their asterisk are stories, gossip, really, that hint at such moments, but they're buried under layers of other narratives, like flotsam on the shore of history. And if we dig deep enough, we might find one or two that ring true, not because they're documented in laws or plays, but because they feel right for a culture that loved its contradictions, where freedom and slavery coexisted, where wine was both symbol and substance, where power could be challenged over a cup, and sometimes, just sometimes, won. But let's not romanticize it too much. A slave who bought his freedom through a drinking contest would have been the exception, not the rule. Most slaves freed themselves through hard work, through saving money, or through their master's whim, whether out of kindness or exhaustion. And for those who did try such contests, they'd likely have faced more backlash than applause. Their victory would have been temporary, their freedom earned in sweat and toil long before the last cup was drunk. So if you're a slave in Athens, dreaming of freedom, drinking might be your way in, but it's not the only way. And if you do win, well, enjoy it while it lasts. The next morning you'll still have to prove yourself all over again. But for that one night, under the light of a symposium lamp, you were more than just property. You were a man or woman who could hold his own. And isn't that worth a toast? Let's raise our cups, not just to the winners, but to the ones who dared to try, even if they lost. Because in the end, it wasn't about the drinking, It was about the living. And sometimes the two are one and the same. So here's to you, whoever you were, the slave who drank, who gambled, who took a chance on freedom, and maybe, just maybe, won. May your cup always be full and your path clear. Now drink up.